Now I can go on Facebook and I can find out that my neighbor just filed for divorce. The same way that I find out that the Dow is down 21 points today. Somebody has posted it. It's their status. It's no longer their burden. Stop. Look at them. Ask yourself, what is it like to be them? As God moves you from me to you, you will find that the impact of your life upon other people will be multiplied 1,000-fold.
So I want to lead off this morning asking you, have you ever had an awkward conversation? I would assume almost all of us could probably raise our hands. Maybe you have something. I saw some eyes rolling. It's like, yeah, I got something that came to mind right now. I can remember the several awkward conversations along the way on my journey, and they always seem to reside, like when I first think about this, I think of all these awkward talks I had to have with my parents through the different stages of my development growing up. You know, when you're younger, it's usually something your parents trying to explain to you why you have to share your toys, right? We're working on this with Addison right now, and she can't quite say why. She's really good at saying no right now. But the normal response from kids is why? Why do I have to do that, right? They question. And they always do that. And I know I always did too. And then you kind of get to the age of being a teenager, and you have to sit down with your kids and you have to talk to them about boys and girls, you know that talk I'm talking about, and they say, "Oh, why?" Right? This is awkward. I don't want to do this. But I have to admit that was not the weirdest conversation I've ever had with my parents. This one far more supersedes the birds and the bees talk. Elizabeth and I were home in the Quad Cities last year. We were visiting my folks, and my dad and I, we were out in the garage, and my dad's always tinkering with a project, and he was building a toy box for my nephew, so I was kind of helping him with that. And just kind of out of the blue, Dad just starts kind of gazing around the garage. And he says, do you see anything in here that you would really want? Like that would be important to you? And I pointed to a workbench that was up at the front of the garage, and my dad and I had done a lot of projects on this workbench, so I have a lot of memories with it. And when I was little, you know, I carved my name in it, and I carved my daddy's name into it, so it has a lot of, you know, sentimental value to me. And I said, yeah, I think I want that. He's like, okay, good, you can have it. I said, sweet. Well, here's the problem. We didn't bring the truck. We brought Liz's car today, so I can't take it with me. He says, no, you can't have it now. I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, I meant when I'm gone. I was like, okay. And then he looks around, he's like, do you see anything else in here that you would want? I was like, this is getting weird. Dad, why? Why are we talking about this? Are you planning something? I don't think that you're going anywhere. He says, well, I just want to have my affairs in order. I just want to have my affairs in order, because I could see where this conversation was heading. It was getting pretty awkward pretty quick. And, you know, I thought Dad had his midlife crisis 3 years before when he bought this. Now, I've showed you this picture before, right? This is Dad's 1965 Chevrolet Impala SS, and that thing is cherry. That thing is smoking, and it's awesome. I thought that's when his midlife crisis was, but apparently the crisis was creeping back that day, because he was trying to get his affairs in order. But it was funny because when we were talking about this, I didn't know that my brother was actually sitting out in the garage. My dad and I didn't know he was sitting out there. And my brother chimed in. He's like, well, if you're not going to claim it, I am. I got dibs on the car. And of course, we laughed about this. And now every time, you know, my brother and I are around my dad back in the Quad Cities, we just look at random stuff that belongs to him and we just say, dibs. Of course, he laughs and rolls his eyes about it. But awkward conversations, right? Do you ever feel that way about spiritual things? I ask you that? Because for many of us, speaking about our faith or witnessing about our faith or just talking about the Bible in general is kind of awkward. Even within the walls of the church, it can be kind of awkward for us. I don't remember who this was. Someone sent me a Facebook message this week. It was a those memes, those pictures with the words on it, and they tell a funny joke, but it was this dog, and he had this wide-eyed look on his face. It said something like, the look you make when your pastor asks you to pray. You know what I'm talking about? Awkward. It can be awkward sometimes. I'll give you an example of this. One time when I was younger, I went to the Mississippi Valley Fair in Davenport. And this is a pretty well-to-do fair, actually, for that part of the state. They get a lot of really good headlining bands, and it's a lot of fun. But I was little at this point. I'm coming up to the gate of the Mississippi Valley Fair, and there's this sidewalk preacher, standing outside the gate, and he's preaching, and it kind of caught my interest. So I walked up to him, and he says, "Little boy, do you know Jesus?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Are you sure you know Jesus?" I was like, I think so. He's like, "How do you know Jesus?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I think I know him. We're all right, And he said, "Well, the earth could open up and you could fall right into the gates of hell if you don't know Jesus." I said, "I'm going to grab some cotton candy and find my mom, I think." That was a bit scary. So that's one extreme, the hellfire damnation sort of stuff, right? And then there's the other extreme, like, "Hey man, are you in harmony with the Creator?" You go all the way from, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good example or not. That was not my seminary. I know some of them that exist like that. But, then you go from this hellfire damnation all the way to this other side where it's this soft little hit you with the pillow fluff kind of theology, right? So the question is, I think today, how do we talk about the soul? How do we talk about the soul? We talked about this a little bit last week. The soul, that place that is deep within you, where all of your predispositions are, that sacred place where you and God meet. How do we talk about that without becoming either of the extreme of those two situations, right? So I just want to get the awkward question. We're going to have one of those moments here a little bit, and you don't have to respond, but I want you to think about this. I'm going to ask you a question. Perhaps you don't get asked this very often. How is it with your soul? Good. Think about that. How is it with your soul? Most of us, I would say, have probably never truly been asked that question. Even if we were, how would we know? How would we know that? What could we use to assess it? Can we really trust our judgment? Sometimes I think we confuse the question with, is your heart right with God? Right? Or are you at peace with yourself? And the answer is either yes or no, but we've never learned to talk about the actual condition of our soul. So how would we know? Last week, I shared with you a story, how when I was in my first world religion class, 101 course, I was in community college in Bettendorf, and the Presbyterian minister that was teaching that class tapped on his, I saw some heads come up, tapped on his desk and said, "Define the soul." That was our reaction. No idea what to say. Some of the students in the class actually held up their shoes. He said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. All right? That's the soul. That place that is deep within you where you and God meet. We've never really learned to talk about the actual condition of our souls. So how would we know? And I think the place to look is behind other questions that we seldom ask. If you want to figure out how it is with your soul, there's probably a set of, and you can come up with your own. But here's some to think about, some questions that can kind of prime the pump in that. What do I think about? Here's a question for you. What do I think about when I'm at that red light? And why do I think about that? Marengo would probably be a stop sign, right? I just thought of. When I'm at that stop sign, what is it that I think about? And what drives that? What motivates that? I don't either. How do I treat people that I live with? What's my greatest fear, and why am I scared of that? What is it that I want? What do I protect more than anything else in life? Here's one. What's the common denominator of everything that I think is funny? The idea to ask ourselves deeper questions and begin clustering the answers around some of those key themes that emerge from this self-discovery, I think is kind of a good way to think about the state of your soul. Those are the kind of things to think about when someone says, how is it with your soul? That deep place within you where you and God meet, right? We learned last week that you can be a follower of Jesus and still not be minded or sold in the same way. The Apostle Paul says, be conformed no longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Right? And I think this can explain a few things. We can be a follower of Jesus and still not be minded like Jesus. This explains how we can have so many Christians in our city without changing the culture. The problem is that not that these Christians are faking it or they're too silent about their witness, but that they're following Jesus and still not oriented. We're not minded like him. I want to show you an example from Scripture of what I'm talking about. Mark chapter 9, verse 31. Jesus and his disciples. They're taking a trip. And I'm going to use a little bit of an illustration here. So when Jesus and his disciples are taking a trip, whether it's to like Jerusalem or Capernaum or whatever that may be, I kind of think, maybe it's just a stage of life that I'm in, but I think of Jesus as kind of like the dad driving the van, you know? And the disciples are like the kids in the back, right? Have any of you ever driven a youth band or a youth van on a mission trip? That's what I imagine when Jesus and the disciples are going somewhere. Yeah, some of you know what I'm talking about, don't you? Yeah. The disciples are in the back of the minivan, so to speak, and I'm going to use that visual to walk through this, okay? So according to the book of Mark, the disciples, they leave Galilee, they're headed toward Jerusalem, where Jesus told them again, what? That the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days, he will rise. So Jesus, this is the second time that Jesus has actually told his disciples that I'm not going to make it. You guys need to be aware of this. Now for the kids in the back of the van, the disciples, this probably elicits a bit of fear, you know. What in the world is Dad talking about? Jesus is saying that he's going to be betrayed. He's going to be killed. And interestingly enough, this, as I said, this is the second time he's stated this. He said this earlier in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, if you want to check it out on your own. But the disciples are hearing what Jesus is saying, but they're having their own discussion in the back of the van. Flip forward to verse 33 for me. They're having their own discussion in the back of the van. And meanwhile, while they're tagging along behind, they're embroiled in this conversation. They get to where they're going. They get the van unloaded, so to speak. And Jesus says, what were you guys talking about back there? You know, when I was telling you that this was going to happen to me? That I was going to suffer, that I was going to die, that I was going to be betrayed. And they kept, what's it say? Go to verse 34. They kept quiet when Jesus asked them this, because on the way, in the back of the van, they had been arguing about who was the greatest. Does that sound stupid to anyone else? That's crazy. I think that's quite a stunning contrast. That's kind of like Dad talking about his own death, and Andy pops up and it says, I have dibs on the Impala. Right? I mean, not appropriate at that moment. Jesus says, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, I'm going to be humiliated, be beaten, and the kids are in the back of the van saying, I'm the greatest, no, I'm the greatest, no, I'm the greatest, no, I'm the greatest, no, I'm the favorite. And no one knows what the disciples argue, but we can be sure each one argued for himself. Peter didn't argue that John was the greatest. Matthew didn't argue for Philip's case. Each disciple pleaded his own case because it was their nature. It's how they're minded. It's the way they're wired. And the irony is that they did all this while following Jesus. Someone of a completely different mind. After following him for 2 years, this is what they do. Even when Jesus is in the midst of explaining his death, they're arguing about who's king of the hill. And this explains a great deal to me. I'm grateful for this. Not only about my own life, but I think about culture, about our churches and Christians everywhere. It explains why frequently Christians are accused of being judgmental. But here's the thing. Jesus was never accused of that, was he? It explains why Christians are often called hypocritical. You ever heard that before? Jesus was never given that label, though, was he? Keep in mind, the definition of Christian is to be Christ-like. It explains why Christians are often called self-righteous, and yet Jesus was called a friend of sinners. This is why Christian folks, we know we struggle to forgive. That's why we sometimes do dishonest things. We may be following Jesus, but we're not oriented, we're not minded like him. I want to give you another example. And I'm going to read this. I just want you to allow this to melt all over you, okay? Hear this. Mark chapter 10, verse 33. We're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. Again, Jesus describing his death to his disciples. And they're going to mock him. They're going to spit on him. They'll flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Listen to this. James and John says to him, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask. Jesus, do us a favor. Do us a real solid, man." He says, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" And they said, "Let one of us sit at the right and the other at your left in your glory." Jesus sits a child in their midst and says, "Do this, be like this, have the faith of a child," but they don't have the mind to do it. And 2 chapters later, Jesus is talking about his sacrifice for the world again when the 2 disciples come forward asking the favor, "Let one of us sit at your right, let one of us sit at your left in your glory." Of course, the position of right and left were places of honor and privilege. In the midst of him describing his own death again. The problem in both cases, it's the same. The disciples, they're following Jesus, but they're not wired like Jesus. They're on the same road, but they're in a different world altogether. Even though they followed Jesus for 2 years, they needed a soul shift. They had to shift from thinking primarily of themselves to thinking primarily of others. They had to shift from me to you. The shift from me to you. Martin Luther, the founder of the Lutheran Church, that makes sense, right? Leader of the Protestant Reformation, said that we are born with this condition where our hearts are turned inward. Where our hearts are curved inward upon itself. We have a genetic flaw towards self-centeredness. Here's some of the symptoms of that. I'm going to talk about me. Maybe you resonate with some of these, okay? We have a critical spirit sometimes. And again, I'm going to think about me. But I think you may share some of this, so I'm going to say we. Sometimes we think we're better. We think our ideas are better than someone else's simply because they're our ideas. And sometimes it takes a faithful person to show us love and show us a new direction. Oftentimes we look out for ourselves first. Let me think about this. When you look at a group photograph that you're in, who do you look for first? Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Again, talking about myself again, I think sometimes we have low self-esteem. We think our appearance or that our performance is lower than that of others, in part because our standards of ourselves are higher than others. How about this one? We can't forgive others. Even more difficult, we can't forgive ourselves. Even when God has forgiven us, our own opinion is still more important. Here's one I do a lot. We talk about ourselves all the time. You know, I talk for a living, right? So I have to be careful about this. We can dominate the conversation. We talk over people, use clever tactics like humor or cynicism to take control of the conversation. Anybody out there ever hold grudges? I'm glad I'm not the only one. Thank you. Over things that were done to us but not someone else. Our hearts are oftentimes turned inward. And here's the radical thing. Jesus is different. Read the Gospels for yourself. Everything this dude does is for someone else. It's an others-focused disposition. While our hearts are often curved inward, his is often curved outward. So when Jesus heard the disciples arguing about which of them is the greatest, he could not have been more perplexed, I think. That kind of argument is completely foreign to his nature. So the most important question of the morning, I think, is how do we, who are wired much like the disciples, whose hearts are curved inward, get to the place where our hearts curve outward? How do we do that? How do we get from the place where our souls shift? From me to you. I'm going to give you some ideas to start with on this. But I think it's important to think of this as a journey. This does not happen in a day, you know. So I want you to think process, not event. And for a guy who likes to get things done, that's hard for me. You know, I always say that God saved me once, but he didn't save me all at once. I'm still under construction. I'm still a work in progress. I would imagine you probably are too. We're going to separate these over the next few weeks to take them one by one in week chunks. This is a journey we're all going to be on at different stages along the way. But my prayer is that we're going to begin to recognize those stages as part of the soul, as the soul shift is taking place. Now here's the first one. I think we need to wake up. Someone say, wake up. Wake up. So I heard some heads pop tall when I did that. That's good. If you're sleeping, now's a good time to listen. We need to recognize that following Jesus is not all that Jesus has in mind. Now that sounds strange, doesn't it? He wants us to have a soul shift at the deepest level, not just have a moral obligation to do good things. Like that moment, I remember this. I remember this very, very specifically, and I'm going to talk, this works for me, so I'm going to talk about me for a second, because I do that, obviously. I remember a few hours after Elizabeth and I were married, and we're up in the hotel room, and we're sipping some champagne, and just, it's a wonderful moment, you know? And then I have this aha moment a few hours after we got married that, oh my gosh, my life is not about me anymore. I mean, I remember that very clearly. It was an aha moment. And then I don't know if you remember this, Elizabeth. This was like 3 weeks later. We're in Dubuque. We're at the Hy-Vee grocery store off of Dodge Street. And there's this kid. that's just throwing an absolute conniption fit in the checkout line. And I leaned over to Liz and I said, our kids will never do that. And then we had a kid, and our kid does that, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. There will be moments along the way that you will just have to have a wake-up call where God is shining a light on something, and I hope you're open to that in this journey the next few weeks, that God will reveal the need in Pastor Matt, that God will reveal the need in you and in all of us, that we are in need of a soul shift. Ask God to wake you up, but be careful. Careful when you ask God for something, because oftentimes God will deliver. And be prepared for that. Ask Him to speak to you during this time. Stage 2 is taking an interest. So we're waking up a little bit here. We're being open to the movement of the Holy Spirit, right? Stage 2, from me to you, is taking an interest in others. Someone say others. Okay, hold on to that. While I was on vacation here a few weeks back, I was reading a book called Love Does by a guy named Bob Goff, and he said something profound in it. He said this. Bring up that Bob Goff quote for me, will you? He said, I used to want to fix people, but now I just want to be with them. Maybe, gentlemen, you can affiliate with me here. I'm a doer. I'm a fixer. And that's not necessarily a good thing if you're a pastor all the time. I used to want to fix people, he said, but now I just want to be with them. Isn't that great? We're so agenda-driven these days. What if we showed interest in people simply because we cared? Last year, I was visiting with a lady, many of you know her, Doris Knutson. Doris has had a lot of health problems the last years of her life. She was in and out of the hospital quite a bit, had pneumonia several times, congestive heart failure, things like that. But I knew she didn't have very much time left. So I went to Rosehaven Nursing Home to visit her and to be with her. And I said, and I do this a lot. Youth group can attest to this. I came up to Doris and I said, Doris, how you doing? She said, good. I was like, that's great. Doris, tell me a story. Tell me a story about you. That's true. And that woman talked for 45 minutes with pneumonia. Just opened up about her kids, about her life, about her love for the Lord, how much she loves First United Methodist Church. And I remember I went there to encourage her that day. She died 2 days later. I went there to encourage her that day, and I was the one who left feeling absolutely blessed. Absolutely blessed. And isn't that just like God to do something like that? Our days are like a crowded airport terminal filled with people and obligations and deadlines, and pretty soon the object in life is to just simply get through it. Any of you ever feel that way sometimes? Man, I was talking with someone the other day. I said, how you doing? They said, oh, I'm still around. I said, well, existing is not living, my friend. That's not living. I think we need to slow down a bit. Start befriending people who can't help you, right? Take an interest in the lives of people who work for you or who you work with. Celebrate what they've done. Notice what they're working on. Ask yourself, what's it like to be them now, given their predicament, their schedules, their limitations and resources? What do they need most? And then maybe ask the question, what do I have that could help them? Stage 3, becoming a servant. Someone say serve. When we take an interest in people, we're still in charge. Think about this for a second. We decide who to help. We decide how much to give them. We decide if our help is appreciated and whether we get the results we want. But when we choose to be a servant, we give up the right to be in charge, and we make ourselves vulnerable. We begin to start doing small things in the hidden places where there's almost no recognition and almost no reward. That's a heart curved outward. And stage 4 is carrying each other's burdens. Doesn't get much more Wesleyan than that. Watching over one another in love. There's no time when we are more like the Trinity than when we carry each other's burdens and enter into each other's lives. When we take up the infirmities of others and bear their sins with them. When we absorb their flaws and failures and still associate with them. Did you know that Jesus was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard? Why do you suppose that is? Yeah, because he went to those places to carry their burdens. We carry each other's burdens when we stand in the gap for them. When we pray for their children as our own, when we suffer alongside them and lose sleep over them. Because when you think of it, here's the deal. There's no greater evidence to me of shifting from me to you. When Jesus was on the cross, and he's alone at this moment. It's only his mother Mary and John there with him. The establishment has abandoned him. His own people have set him to be murdered. And he's hanging there on a cross, about to die. Do you remember what he says? He says, Father, forgive them. I don't know of a better example of me to you than that. And if that seems as foreign to you as it does to me right now, that concept, because that's the difference between following Christ and having the mind of Christ, of being minded like Christ. That's the shift at the soul level that I pray will happen for each and every single one of us. Last week we talked about this doctrine of Christian perfection. Now that's a weird thing to say. When we know that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, who's going to get that right? What Paul is saying, what John Wesley is saying, what Jesus is saying, that Christian perfection is not about getting it right. It's about your motives, your heart, your soul. It shifts. And what you do becomes motivated out of love for God and love for neighbor. Not saying you're going to get it right all the time, but your soul and your heart and your inclinations are radically different. That's a soul shift. And if Jesus hanging on the cross saying, forgive them, seems radically weird, if it seems as weird to you as it does to me, then I think we're all in need of a soul shift. Think how that would change things, how that would change your home, how that would change your marriage and your parenting, or the way you influence your grandchildren. So here's what I want to give you some homework this week. Is that permissible? I want to challenge you to interpret life in a shift from me to you. From inward to outward. And wherever you are in that shift from me to you, I pray that you would ask God to help you find your way in that in the next stage and get ready for God to respond in that. Hope you'll join us over the next few weeks. We're going to keep going a little bit deeper into this as we continue to grow and talk about the ways we naturally respond to God's grace and the doctrine of Christian perfection. My friends, I thank you for being with us today. I thank you for worshiping with us today. I invite you to go from this place bearing witness to the love of God and the grace of Jesus Christ in such a way that all who find His love as a stranger will find in us generous and gentle friends. Service is over. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.